Hello, everyone. I just sent an email out a few minutes ago. I am still working on your labs from last week, which is the intro to, today I'm a biologist part one. Really enjoying them. Great work so far. So in order to make time to have those back for you in a timely fashion, I'm recording the lecture session now, as opposed to 8:30 this evening, and then I'll get your labs looked at this evening. So just some announcements before going a bit further. I just posted lab for this week on Canvas, and instead of, as the syllabus says, lab this week being ecology in your backyard or ecology in your neighborhood, I think I rescheduled it. I had a change of heart, and I now would like you to do a lab on urban ecology, which is actually something I've done in another class that I've taught at CSUB. This project that I'm going to have you work on. The nice thing about it, I hope you find this nice, is that you're going to have 2 weeks to work on this particular lab, which works out well for a variety of reasons. Next Monday, a week from today, you have your first exam, which means that you won't have a lab due on the day of the exam, so one less moving piece. And then you have a whole other week after that to do that. And so this lab is worth 40 points. It's worth twice the typical lab, but it is going to involve some more legwork on your end relative to a lab that will only take 1 week. I posted the instructions document on Canvas. Basically, what I've asked you to do is measure the amount of waste that you produce over a 3-day period and write a report on it. And we can talk more about any questions you may have at a later time. Just go ahead and look over that document now, and be working on it. You can start now. I think it's fairly straightforward. Basically, you'll be measuring the weight of the trash you produced over a 3-day period, and then you'll write a report in your biology lab notebook. You're gonna create your own hypothesis, your own prediction, and analyze some data, create a graph. And you're gonna have 2 weeks to do this. So we'll talk more about it, but it is going to require 3 days of collecting data. And so if you start the day before it's due, which it's due on September 28th, which is 2 weeks from today, if you start the day before it's due, well, that won't work. You need to have at least 3 days to do it. I would recommend still budgeting at least a week to do the whole thing in terms of collecting the data as well as writing the report. Okay, so we'll talk more about that as time goes on. So as I said, I'm still grading the last couple of labs. One thing I've noticed is on the Today I'm a Biologist lab, there were a handful of folks who unfortunately didn't turn it in. And I just want to emphasize, if you're struggling, if what I'm asking you to do is in any way unclear, if you need help, if you need a one-on-one study session, if there's anything I can do, if there's something that I'm not doing that's contributing to something that is making it hard for you to do this, please let me know. I'm willing to work with you. This is an online environment. It's unusual for most of us. So if you are struggling in any way to complete the weekly lab assignments, to complete the quizzes, and any of the things that are going on in a typical week, please let me know. Send me an email. We can meet on Zoom and discuss anything in as much detail as you like. I am here for you. Just as a reminder, one lab is 20 points, and so in the grand scheme of things, if you miss one lab, it's not that big of a deal. But if you miss more than 3 labs, it says in the syllabus that that's an automatic fail for the course. And so that would be really concerning for me if you miss, even 2 labs, that kind of takes into account, let's say you get sick, don't worry about lab that week. It's just 20 points, not a big deal. But if you miss 3 labs for whatever reason, and if there's no kind of background reason for that, like emergency, then that's a fail for the course. And so I do not want that to happen to you. So please let me know if you're struggling in any way, and we can connect you with any resources you may need. Today I'm going to have a short lecture on evolution and natural selection that will be short. It is the last bit of material that we will cover before next week's exam. So this Wednesday, the day after tomorrow, which is Wednesday, September 16th at 8:30 p.m., I'm going to be on the recurring Zoom link, which you can find under the lecture module, and I'll be hanging out for as long as you need me to answer any questions you may have. Please sign in, Zoom in, as some people say, ask any questions, and we can go over past PowerPoint slides, anything you need. I've also posted a study guide on Canvas underneath the exams tab, which is live as well. And so we can go over any of those concepts again in a live format, which in my view is way better than the recordings, to go over anything that you're concerned with, struggling with. Let's do that. So Wednesday the 16th, which is the day after tomorrow, that's when we are going to have the first review session. And then a week from today, next Monday, is when the first exam is going to be. Okay, going forward, just a recap on what we discussed last time. If you remember, we discussed ecosystem ecology, just so a series of questions for you. Question number 1 is, what is an ecosystem? Well, we defined an ecosystem as a biological community. So remember, a community is a group of populations in the same place at the same time. So all of those interspecific interactions, predations, mutualisms, and so forth. An ecosystem is a community with all of the abiotic factors that could be affecting that community. So things like rain, slope, aspect, nutrient availability. The list goes on. It's a complex suite of things which could be affecting community function. That is an ecosystem. So it's a community plus the non-living aspect of the community, the abiotic factors. What are the 6 elements that make up most of life? Not the only elements that make up life, but the 6 most important ones, the organic elements as they're called. We went ahead and defined those as carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur. A good acronym is SHNOPS. So CHNOPS. And we'll talk more about that, especially in the next unit, how these different elements play a really important role affecting biological processes. But for the purposes of ecosystem ecology, we talked about nutrient availability, which that's why they're coming in here. And then what is the term that describes how essential, basically these 6 organic elements cycle through ecosystems? What's the term? It's a kind of a 3-pronged term. We said that was a biogeochemical cycle, which is living geological chemical cycles wherein nutrients that affect communities and ecosystems oscillate between the living and the abiotic realms. They constantly are changing forms. So remember, we talked about the water cycle and how it oscillates between the atmosphere and the oceans and the fresh waters and living systems, like you drinking water and it becoming part of your body, and it's constantly cycling back and forth and being repackaged in a variety of different ways. That is all an example of a biogeochemical cycle. And lastly, I find this, it seems kind of a specific thing to ask, but it's really important actually. What was the feature, those odd wart-like features that we discussed on some plants that have the ability to take atmospheric nitrogen and fix it, quote unquote, fix it, in other words, convert it into a form that's usable for most living things, including you and me. We went ahead and said that those structures are called root nodules, which is actually a mutualism between a plant and a microbe that lives in the root nodules in the plant. And the microbes have the ability to fix atmospheric nitrogen from the atmosphere, and so the plant benefits by getting a source of nitrogen directly from the microbes. And then the plant benefits the microbes by providing sugars from photosynthesis that then the microbes can use to fuel their biological processes. So it's very much a mutualism and an interspecific interaction. And we went ahead and defined these root nodules as being very important for most multicellular life on Earth, because we need nitrogen as part of our regular biological processes, and because we cannot synthesize it ourselves, because we cannot get it from the atmosphere ourselves, we have to eat other things that have nitrogen. It's really from these root nodules, the base primary producer of biological nitrogen. And it's thanks to that that we're alive. So thank you, root nodules. Okay, so today we're going to go ahead and dive in very briefly to evolution and natural selection, which is found in chapter 13 of your textbook. Just to briefly start out by talking about the classification of organisms, a little bit of history here. It's true that if we're talking about the science of naming things, of calling individual organisms by their names, this is something that people, us, we've been doing this for a long time, basically since, the dawn of human intelligence. We have been categorizing things that this is such and such a plant, this is such and such an animal. We've been naming things according to categories for a very long time. So really, even before we have written records, before recorded history, peoples from all over the earth have been doing this. And so it's a very long tendency that we humans have to do. But if we go back into basically as far back into recorded history as we can, 5,000, 4,000 years ago. So still a pretty long time where recorded history began. That's not the beginning of human history, but the beginning of recorded human history. If we go back to some of those earliest written records, what were the first written records of people actually classifying organisms? Well, you can go back into ancient Mesopotamia even, but one of the first very widespread people to really in a systematic way attempt to classify organisms was Aristotle, the Greek. We often think of Aristotle as being a philosopher, but he wasn't merely a philosopher. He was a mathematician, he was an artist, he was all kinds of things, including a biologist. And so in some of his early writings, he was actually classifying different plants and animals that he was seeing in his native Greece into different categories. So he was being a biologist way back in the day. And so this was, 384 BC. So golly, a long time ago, 2,500 years ago, at least. Wow, that's a lot. And it certainly, he was not the first person to do it, but he was one of the first people that we have written records that we can refer back to today and say, yes, Aristotle was naming these things. He called them by this name. So it's pretty cool. Skipping over a lot of history, and if there's any history buffs in the class, I apologize for how much I'm skipping over here. But if we skip over almost 2,000 years, there is a Belgian by the name of Carl Linnaeus. Maybe you've heard of him before, this guy right here. So really, really not that long ago in the grand scheme of things, in the 1700s, he was the first person to actually propose a systematic way of a systematic procedure of naming things, because there were so many things that were being named. He was the first person to try to make it uniform, a system of taxonomy. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. We can't not talk about Charles Darwin, who was a biologist in the 1800s who had a really huge effect. His theories had a huge effect on the field of biology. We'll talk about him. He named all kinds of things as well. Kind of speaking, why are we talking specifically about Darwin and Linnaeus, is that it's estimated that today, there are almost 8.5 million species in the world. But biologists have only managed to officially name just over 1 million of them. Okay, so think about it. All of the species that we've named, in terms of like a legitimate scientific name, that's only about 1 million. 1 million is still a lot. That's a lot of names, but it's not even close to half the total number of species that likely exist out in nature. So we're nowhere near in terms of, we haven't named everything. There's still plenty to discover. And because we're dealing with numbers of species that are in the millions, that is why it's necessary to have a unified system of taxonomy. Because if you have, as I said, many people groups throughout all human history have had different approaches to naming things. Such and such a people group has named things according to their way. Other people groups have named things in their tradition, which is all wonderful. But if you don't have a single system for laying a foundation in regards to what things are named, how they're named, the rules by what they're named, if you don't have a single system, when you're dealing with millions of species, scientific collaboration regarding species A or species B really wouldn't be possible. You have to have that same language of taxonomy. And that's what Linnaeus did. He proposed this one language of taxonomy for the purpose of trying to get a handle of this amazing complexity and diversity of millions of species. So this is what's called the Linnaean system of classification. It's obviously named after Linnaeus. And I'm sure you've heard of this before. This actually is not the only system of classification. In fact, there are some biologists who are even positing that this system of classification is a little bit obsolete. They're proposing, on the basis of recent advances from the field of genomics, that this system, is kind of obsolete, that there's a more sophisticated way of categorizing things. But for the most part, most biologists still tend to keep to this system of classification, the Linnaean system of classification. It really has the most practical application. And again, you've probably heard of this before, organized into a hierarchy of 8 tiers, so starting at the very broadest level, at the domain level, and getting all the way down to the things that we think of as species. The key to the Linnaean system is that it's a system based on Latin. That's why you often hear, whenever people use the scientific names of things, it sounds like it's a big mouthful. Well, it is a big mouthful. The reason why is because the whole system of taxonomy, the system of classification, is based on the language of Latin, which is the parent language of the Romantic languages, Spanish, French, Italian, to a certain extent, English. It was at one point, one of the most important languages in the world, and it has a very kind of linear way, a very linear etymological construction for the language itself. And so that it is the language of science as a whole, but specifically in regards to how things are named. So every species in the world under the Linnaean system has a Latin name. And the full Latin name for every species is called a Latin polynomial. And if you're good at your Latin prefixes and suffixes, what does poly mean? Poly means multiple, right? And nomial means name. So a Latin polynomial is a multifaceted name. And so I don't speak Latin, but if you're truly using the Linnaean system in its true form, and if you're talking about a particular species, every species has a great long description in Latin describing in detail about what that species looks like, where it's found, what its morphology is, what its anatomy is. And imagine, Eus Deo Machina, I don't speak Latin, so that's really bad. But it's basically multiple paragraphs that it takes to basically lay out a Latin polynomial, which is, as you can imagine, pretty unwieldy. So what do we call our species, for example? Humans. We call ourselves Homo sapiens, right? And that's easy to say. We're humans. We're the genus Homo and the species Sapiens. That's the genus and the species right there in the Linnaeus classification system. We use the binomial because it's just way easier to use. But in order for you to have a full polynomial name, you have to start with the full name is domain, eukarya, kingdom, animalia, phylum, chordata, class, odonta, and you have to that is the full name. And so thankfully we concern ourselves for the most part with this two-part Latinized name that's italicized, just because it's easier to use. But really the whole system of classification is based on all 8 tiers. And if you're going to give the full name of something, you have to give the full 8-tier description in Latin. And that's exactly what Linnaeus did. If you read Linnaeus's early writings, his species treatments, his names for things were these great long paragraphs, and that was the name. So thank goodness we don't have to do that. So to start at the very top tier, right here, the very top tier of the Linnaean system is called the domain. And there are only 3, the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukarya, okay? For the most part in this class, especially up until now, we've been talking about the eukarya. And we'll, especially when we talk about cell structure in the next unit, we'll talk about the differentiating features between these 3 domains. It's really distinctions at the cellular level that differentiate between these 3 domains of life. We're most, you and I belong to the eukarya domain. The bacteria, that's kind of another one of those colloquial terms. We say bacteria very commonly, but bacteria actually is a domain of things, and there are a very distinct suite of cellular characteristics that allow something to be categorized under the domain bacteria. And then there's this further group that was actually only described relatively recently, the archaea, which we won't spend as much time on, but they themselves are pretty interesting as well. So the 3 domains of life, all life on planet Earth falls into one of these three domains. This again is just the same, this is our treatment under the human beings' treatment under the Linnaean system. So, actually it doesn't go all the way down to the domain level. We're in the domain eukarya, but then we're in such and such a kingdom. We're in the phylum chordates, or in the animal kingdom, class Mammalia, order primates, family hominids, genus Homo. Our species is Homo sapiens. Sapiens is what's called our specific epithet, which is our species name. Okay, so this is Linnaean system. I'm sure you've heard of this before. It really harkens back to Carolus Linnaeus in the 1700s. So I said all that to say, okay, we have this system of classification that's based on these 8 tiers. Linnaeus developed it. It's based on Latin. It's complicated, right? And we've officially done, about 1/9 of all the species in the world have a formal Latinized description. So let's shift gears, talking about what is evolution. The real crux of today's lecture is about evolution. And maybe if you're anything like me, before I really took evolution in college, I really didn't have the firmest idea about what evolution is, right? And I think, as a society, there's still a lot of misconceptions about what evolution is. It's kind of one of those terms that some people can, when they hear the word evolution, they automatically think something really specific. So I hope to, kind of demystify this concept of evolution a little bit, maybe make it seem a little bit less ominous. So what is evolution? It's a confusing concept for many people. Some people think they know what it is, but they really don't. So what do you think when you hear the term? I know when I was a kid, I'm a product of the 80s and 90s. So when I was a kid, some of you maybe are around my age, I loved to play Pokemon. I played the Pokemon trading card games back when Russo's was in the marketplace there. And then I played all the original handheld games, yellow version, gold version. I'm still an avid Pokemon player. I'm a kind of a nerd that way. But this is, if you had asked me when I was a kid what evolution is, I probably would have said something like this, right? This is Bulbasaur, and at level 16, Bulbasaur evolves into Ivysaur. And then at level 32, Ivysaur evolves into Venusaur, and the same thing for Charmander, evolving into Charmeleon, and then evolving into Charizard, right? If you watch the original Pokemon anime, which is on Netflix now, that's kind of nostalgic. That's what they say. They're evolving. What's something that's pretty notable about how Pokemon evolve? It's spontaneous, right? Your Pokemon reaches such and such an experiment level, and then it gets all shiny, and then a few minutes later, it completely metamorphosizes, and it's a completely different organism 2 seconds later, right? That's what a lot of people in our culture think that evolution is. In fact, I should have it with me. I'm here in my office right now, but I have a Life book. It's basically a magazine from the 1950s, sitting on my shelf at home. That those old Life magazines, they used to be hardcover. This particular issue of Life magazine from the 1950s, the focus of it was evolution, and the title photo is a lizard on a rock on some kind of intertidal marine environment, and it's stepping out. It's like emerging out of a crab husk. Like, okay, the crab, it was a crab 5 seconds ago, but poof, out pops the lizard, right? Very much a Pokemon-esque form of evolution. There are a lot of folks still who think that that's what evolution is. Do you think that's what evolution is? No. Evolution is not this instantaneous poof type thing where 1 second you have one organism, the next second you have something entirely different. That is not evolution at all. So evolution is just change over time. That's all it is. And we're talking about vast quantities of time over the course of thousands, millions, even billions of years. Evolution is just incremental, very slow change over time. First of all, it's a theory. Okay, so we call it the theory of evolution, not the law of evolution. So it's a theory because it's a widely accepted explanation based on a really large body of evidence. It's broader than a hypothesis. There have been millions, at this point, there have been millions of individual experiments and studies that have examined evolution in one way or another and have affirmed that, yes, evolution, many affirmed, accepted hypotheses lead to a theory. So it's a widely accepted explanation based on a very large, robust body of evidence. It's really broader than a hypothesis, but it's not a law. In fact, it's very hard to pin down anything in biology as obeying a law. There's always something that disobeys any kind of law constraint. And I'll show you an example of that here in a couple slides. Evolution is just a theory. For the most part, it's widely accepted. There's a heck of a lot of evidence out there, but that doesn't mean it's uniformly manifest across all living things everywhere. There are examples where it doesn't seem to be happening at all, where things are relatively static for billions of years. So again, a theory is just, it's basically a theory that everything living today, or most of the things living today, are descendants of ancestral species from thousands to millions to billions of years ago that were different. The species that are alive today are different than the species that existed, that the ancestral species that existed in the distant past. And so there has been change over time. That is what evolution is. So this gets back to the idea of what a species is. If you remember back to the community ecology lecture series, we defined the biological species concept, it's all capitalized here. So this is the biological species concept, which defines a species as individual organisms that actually reproduce in nature and produce viable offspring. So they have they're conserved through time, through biological time. So think about from one generation to the next, a lion giving birth to lion cubs, and then those lion cubs getting older and having their offspring, and then the next generation, and the next generation, and the next generation. Within one generation to the next, or even within 1,000 years to 2,000 years, any kind of changes that are going on are really not that noticeable. If we were to go back in time 2,000 years ago to the African savannah, the lions that we would see running around 2,000 years ago wouldn't have looked all that different than the lions that are there today. There probably would have been a lot more of them, but in terms of their appearance and their physiology and their genetics, 2,000 years, not that long time ago, however many generations that is, not really that much noticeable. Does that mean evolution hasn't been going on? Well, that gets a little bit wonkier there. Over the space of about 2,000 years, very, very slow incremental changes. When we're talking about evolution, we're talking about a process that takes place over the course of millions to billions of years again. This also gets back to our history specifically. For the most part, we are the product of Western civilization here in the United States, as opposed to Eastern civilization. Our sort of broad cultural ethos comes a lot from, ancient, our foundation a lot comes from like ancient Greece and Rome, our system of government, our representative government, democracy, all of that, is a product of really Western civilization, right? For a lot of our history, we've had this Judeo-Christian belief system. We're all a product of that, whether or not you are a faithful person or not. This is our history, right? And the Judeo-Christian belief system has had the emphasis through most of history that the idea of a species is something that was fixed through time from the very beginning of creation to the present day. So back in the beginning, when God created the world, he created a fixed number of species, and they were there right from the very beginning, and they have existed to the present time unchanged, that they're fixed from the beginning of the universe to present time. That has been the tradition that's been taught for the most part in Aristotelian and Judeo-Christian belief systems and cultures. That's not necessarily something that's 100% consistent with biblical stuff, but I digress there. I can really easily get off into a huge tangent. But that's, for the most part, what a lot of people have been taught, that species are species. They are fixed in time. They're permanent. Well, the field of biology, especially in the last couple hundred years, has made a progress away from that. And I'm speaking as a person of faith myself. Everyone, of course, has different beliefs and different worldviews, which is totally great. But in the field of biology itself, it's generally emphasized today that species are not fixed. And this really began, more than 200 years ago, when people in the 1600s first began digging up fossils, these huge fossilized remains of these animals that obviously lived thousands of years ago. Can you imagine back in the 1600s, if I say the word dinosaur right now, you of course know what I'm talking about. But 400, 500 years ago, only like the most well-educated elite people in the universities would have any idea what a dinosaur is. The common, ordinary people of the day in those times, did not have access to the wealth of knowledge. Knowledge was far less equitable in those days, and so people didn't know what dinosaurs were. Can you imagine? Finding out that think about it. Think about if the first dinosaur bone was only discovered yesterday. Some scientist somewhere discovered this huge, massive skeleton of what looks to be a reptile that was 40 feet long from snout to end of tail. Can you imagine how big of an impact that would have had on your worldview if you did not know previously that dinosaurs existed? That would have been a huge influence on the way you change things. And so as people began to discover the fossil record and really begin to think, wow, there are things that were alive in the distant past that are not alive today, that is weird, and start asking questions along that line, it doesn't take long to imagine that people then began to realize and start to concur that species have indeed changed over time. What used to exist does not necessarily exist now, and what exists now did not necessarily exist in the past. So that really, a large part came of that from first beginning to examine fossils. So of course, things like the Tyrannosaurus rex, and maybe you recognize things like trilobites, a very famous fossil that you can even buy in fossil shops. This is actually a picture of Archaeopteryx, which is kind of an intermediary dinosaur between dinosaurs and archosaurs and ultimately birds. This was a dinosaur, but it had feathers. It could probably fly. It probably looked more like a bird than a dinosaur, but it was a dinosaur. And things like Amorites and things like this. So we kind of look at these things without too much surprise with our modern 21st century lens, right? But can you imagine 500 years ago, people never having seen something like this, how big of an impact it would have had on your worldview? It really would have changed everything. Just like imagine if aliens were to come tomorrow and land in the capital and start speaking English and telling us things. Can you imagine? I know people have different beliefs in that, but imagine if that were true, if that did happen, how big of an impact that would have on our worldview now, because as of now, there is no direct evidence of extraterrestrial life. But if that evidence were to suddenly manifest itself tomorrow, imagine how big of an impact that would be, how people's worldviews would change overnight. That was what, kind of the best modern day equivalent I could give in terms of when people first began to study the fossil record. So this, again, people even began to find fossilized remains of other people that were different from the people that exist today. So other hominids in the genus Homo, and even other hominids that were of different genera. These were people, right? People that were living, breathing, thinking, loving things that were probably really intelligent. Very close to our intelligence as Homo sapiens, and yet they were very distinctly different than us. Think of Gigantopithecus, which you can actually go see a fossil down in the San Diego Museum of Natural History. A huge, think of a gorilla that is standing on its hind feet and is like 9-10 feet tall. These were hominids that existed. It's amazing to think about. There's a normal dude right there. Of course, the Neanderthals, that's an artist's rendition of what they would have looked like. These were people. They were people, and yet they were not us. They were different than us. It's quite interesting to think about in the grand scheme of things, that there used to be other people besides people. That's almost a philosophical question, but clearly there's been change through time. Oh, this is kind of more of a joke than anything. There are some shows out there that so there are people out there who still believe that Bigfoot exists, that it's out there in the wild, and they do safaris for it. People think that it's like basically a Neanderthal that somehow survived to the modern day. I myself, I'm a skeptic, but who knows? Isn't it funny how the pictures of Bigfoot that always surface online are always blurry? In fact, I think it was a comedian, Mitch Hedberg, who said, "I think Bigfoot is blurry, period. That's why the pictures of him are always blurry." It's funnier when he said it. But anyway, that's more of a joke. So again, evolution is just a theory. Okay, it's a widely accepted phenomenon on the basis of a huge amount of evidence that change in species occur over time. But that does not mean that it's uniformly manifest, that it's fundamental across all life. So some things seem to be an exception to evolution. The one would be horseshoe crabs. So these are little crabs that you can still go see today. If you go like to the shores of Maine over on the East Coast during the right time of year, they come onto the beach to breed. These are creatures that, if you look back at the fossil record, they're basically the exact same today that they were 450 million years ago. So that was before the time of the dinosaurs, right? These are things that were alive and well and had been there for millions of years already, well before the time of the dinosaurs. The dinosaurs have come and gone. 450 million years later, we can still see the horseshoe crabs washing up on shore, doing the same exact thing that they've probably been doing for millions of years in the same place. And they're essentially unchanged from the fossil record. You can hold up a living fossil, you can hold up a horseshoe crab right next to its corresponding fossil and note, this is the same exact thing. Very little change. And the reason why, it lives really deep in the ocean normally, in an environment that's relatively static, not a lot of change over time. And this particular scheme, its shape, the hardness of its shell, its feeding habits, it hasn't needed to change over time. And so it is what it is. And that doesn't mean it won't evolve in the future, but for the purposes of the last half a billion years, this particular example, it has not evolved, noticeably speaking. Also in terms of genetically speaking too. I mean, it's basically the same critter. So it has not evolved at all. So, people call these types of things living fossils, things that are unchanged relative to the fossil record. It's pretty cool. So going back to a little bit of, human history here, along came Darwin. And I'm sure you've heard the term or the name Darwin before. And if you've seen a picture of Darwin, if you look up Charles Darwin on Google or something, you've probably gotten that picture of Darwin as an old grumpy man with that long beard and that big white head. He just looks kind of like a grumpy person. That was, he was actually old enough in the later part of his life to have a picture taken of him, and that, he was old enough to, these were the very early days of photography. But what he's most famous for was a journey that he made actually when he was a young man, when he was in his 20s and 30s, when he voyaged out on a ship called the Beagle in the 1830s. He left England and he spent 5 years going around the world. He left England here. He came down to South America. He crossed back. He went across the Cape Cod region of South Africa. Oh, I'm doing it backwards. He did it this way. He came down across South America, around. Of course, he spent time in the Galapagos, which is what he's by far the most famous for. And then he came back. He sailed all the way around the world, back through Australia, and then around the Horn of Africa, and then all the way back home to England. So it took him 5 years. He sailed all the way around the world. A lot of folks think that he just spent time as an old man on the Galapagos Island, which is off the coast of South America, but that's not the case. He was a young man, and he spent 5 years traveling all around the world. During that time, he had a biology notebook, and he was making observations. He was drawing pictures. Remember that back to the pictures I showed you on the first lab day? He spent this entire time during these 5 years notebooking on what he saw, and it was thanks to those notebooks, the notes that he kept, that allowed him to first develop his theory of evolution via natural selection. So that's why I'm having you do a biology lab notebook. It can have really, really instrumental effects on the field. Not just in biology, but across all disciplines. It's a very handy methodology to undertake. There's a picture of the Beagle, by the way. And, when he was a young man, that was before the advent of photography, so that was an oil painting. But that's what he looked like when he was doing this. So he's obviously most well known for the time he spent from, really not that long, about a month, in the Galapagos archipelago. So this is, what he's most famous for. You've probably heard of Darwin's finches. It was these finches that he took really really detailed notes and drawings on. He, during this month that he was here, he hopped back and forth across these various islands. Each one of these islands off the coast of South America, the Galapagos, each of them have really high rates of endemism. So the species that you might see here on Charles Island are completely different from the species over here on Duncan Island or on James Island or on Abingdon. Even though these islands are really close to one another, they've been separated from each other for such a length of time that the species, through the competitive exclusion principle, remember the competitive exclusion principle, which is the idea that species that are too similar in terms of their ecosystem niches, their ecological niches, if their niches are too similar, something's got to give. One species has to change or go somewhere else. In the context of this archipelago, these really limited resources in this small island environment, you get this speciation of all these different species, especially these finches. All these finches, over 40 species that have evolved. Some have evolved to eat a certain type of seed. Others have evolved to eat some are carnivorous. Look at the difference in the beak structures. These are all very closely related finches that are found in the Galapagos Island. They all evolved from one common ancestor, and they speciated over evolutionary time. They changed through time through this process of the competitive exclusion principle. And so that all came from this one ancestor from South America. Okay, so one single common ancestor. Anyway, so all that led to Darwin's theory of natural selection, which he sat on. So, going back to this slide here, he spent, this month here in the Galapagos archipelago, and he spent the 1830s on the Beagle. So again, he was a young man when he did this. So when he arrived back in England in 1836, he spent the better part of 20 years 30 years really, sitting on this massive trove of notebook. Getting back to why this biology notebook is such a valuable process to go through. He sat on it for part of 30 years, didn't do much with it. He actually had a different career in that time. But as he became older, he eventually decided to publish. In fact, he published because one of his peers in the field was kind of very close to describing evolution, and Darwin wanted to get his research out before the other person. So in 1859, he published On the Origin of Species, which basically posits what we've been talking about so far, which is that evolution occurs with descent through modification. So very slow incremental changes over time necessitate this change. So, going back to this example right here with the finches, all of them arrive from some single common ancestor. In the Galapagos Islands, I think, probably, million to 2 million years ago. And through the competitive exclusion principle, they all radiated out to get different sources of food. Some peck on wood to get insects on the inside of trees. Some eat the seeds that fall on the ground. Some eat the seeds that came off of cactuses. This is all a result of speciation through the competitive exclusion principle, and change over time through that is what enabled these different species of finch to evolve, descent with modification. So it's changing environmental conditions. In this case, the competitive exclusion principle prompted these changes, all with the goal to survive. So, species diverged to take advantage of a wider array of environmental resources and food in order to survive. Okay, so you've probably heard the term survival of the fittest. It's basically the organisms that are the best at getting food and surviving and having offspring themselves. The particular traits that allow those organisms to do that, those are the ones that are going to survive in the long term and maintain their presence in the gene pool. Okay, so it's those exact traits. This is natural selection. So natural selection is basically the idea that species change over time, and those traits that change over time that end up being more useful under specific environmental circumstances, those traits are going to allow those particular individuals that have those traits to survive, to get food, and to produce offspring, which they'll be like their parents, so they'll have those same traits. And those are the ones that will survive in the long term relative to the individuals that don't have those traits. Those ones will eventually die out. That is survival of the fittest. That is evolution via natural selection. It's just slow incremental change over time on the basis of which traits are most advantageous for survival. So here are just a few examples. Let me get a drink here. We often talk about cheetahs as being the fastest land animals on the earth, which they are. But not all cheetahs are, not all cheetahs are the fastest. The cheetahs that tend to be the fastest have an arm length, a forearm length that's a certain length. If the forearm length of a cheetah is too long, that can, like this picture here on the right, that can decrease the speed with which the cheetah is able to kind of do a slow-mo video. Look up a slow-mo video of a cheetah running. They're designed to run. But cheetahs with forearms that are too long, it decreases their efficiency. Likewise, cheetahs that have forearms that are too short, it also decreases their efficiency. So evolution via natural selection for cheetahs have been ones with the advantageous trait in this case are the cheetahs with an optimal leg length. Those are the ones that are able to move the fastest. Those are the ones that are able to get the most prey, therefore have young, therefore survive. And so cheetahs have a forearm length of a certain size. They don't tend to be too long and don't tend to be too short. Giraffes, if you go back in the fossil record, the ancestor of giraffes looked more like, kind of a zebra in stature. Okay, so they had shorter necks. But why would it be advantageous for something like this to happen? Well, think back millions of years ago. Giraffes that had slightly longer necks were able to reach up into the trees and get leaves that slightly shorter giraffes weren't able to get. And so over time, giraffes with slightly longer necks were the ones that were eating better, and they were the ones that were having offspring. And if you take that out over thousands to millions of years, there's very slow incremental change over time, where nowadays, the only giraffes that are living are the ones that have the genes for long necks, and it's probably has gotten more pronounced over time. And so, a million years ago, giraffes would have had shorter necks, but this trait has become, the long neck trait has become more advantageous over time because it allows these individuals to get access to food that they wouldn't otherwise have. Sharks are another good example, and this isn't just sharks, but anything that big fish that swim in the open ocean. You tend to notice that a lot of fish tend to be dark on the top and light on the bottom. Why would that be a useful trait to have? Well, you can imagine this is a predator, right? This is a predator that wants to eat other fish. This shark does not want the fish that are swimming above it in the water to see the shark swimming beneath it. So if fish, swimming above this shark in the water look down, they're looking down on a dark surface of this shark, and what's underneath the shark? They're looking down into the ocean, like where it's really dark. And so this being dark on top allows the shark to be camouflaged, and it increases the chance that the shark will be undetected when fish are looking down. Likewise, if the shark is swimming above the fish that it wants to eat, and and the fish look up toward the shark, they're seeing the lighter underbelly of the shark. And if it's during daytime and they're looking up, they're seeing, of course, the natural light from the sun, which the lighter side allows the shark to be camouflaged against. And so over time, you get this distinct blend of being darker on top and lighter on bottom, because this specific palette, the specific color scheme, allows the sharks to get prey that they wouldn't otherwise get. If you flipped this, where the sharks were light on top and dark on the bottom, they would stick out more. And the sharks that have that particular color scheme probably wouldn't be able to get as many prey as the sharks who have this one. And so this is evolution via natural selection. It works for these sharks. That's why most sharks these days tend to have that particular color scheme. And lastly, this is the peppered moth experiment. It was one of the early. It was when Darwin first published his book, The Origin of Natural Selection via the Origin of Species via Natural Selection. There were, as there are today still, there were in those early days a lot of skeptics of his work. It wasn't until the early 1900s that people began to take his work more seriously. And one of the first very robust experimental projects that actually had robust data that demonstrated that evolution via natural selection is taking place was this peppered moth experiment. This took place in England, more specifically around London, in and around the time of the Industrial Revolution. Back in the Industrial Revolution, people, this wasn't just in London, but in London, people generally heated their homes with coal. This was back in the days where coal was the primary heat source. And coal, of course, is a terrible environmental pollutant. When you heat it, it gives off these soot. Think of like people used to have chimney cleaners come at least once a year to clean out their chimneys because the soot built up to such a high degree in their chimneys. Because people had to use coal. It was all they had available to heat their homes. And so there was a lot of coal dust being given off in the environment surrounding London. And that coal dust was just going everywhere. And it was coating the surrounding forests around London, the trees more specifically. And so the trees around London were getting darker and darker and darker from this really thick dusting of coal dust. Whereas the trees that were further and further away from London didn't have as thick of a coal dust, and they were kind of had that more natural brownish texture. And so this was a really early fundamental experiment where it was these pair of researchers. I think they were a married couple. I'm forgetting their names at the present moment. They collected data on these peppered moths over decades. I think at least 30 decades, or no, 3 decades, so 30 years. They collected annual data on the color, on the demographics. They were population ecologists. And so they were collecting direct demographic data on these peppered moths, the moths that were close to London where the trees were covered in soot, and the moths that were further away from London that were not covered in soot. And they noticed that over time, the moths that were closer to London that were surviving in higher numbers are the ones that were a little bit darker, because they blended in with the sooty covered trees. Whereas the moths that were surviving in higher numbers away from London were the ones that were more peppery, because they were better camouflaged against the trees where the trees were not as covered with coal dust. And so over time, these two species of moth, the peppered moth versus the coal moth, these used to be the same species. Now they're entirely separate species. They've speciated out. And this was a direct result. The couple that were studying this basically observed this speciation event, where you get the peppered moth versus the coal moth, and their data demonstrated that this is evolution via natural selection is what enabled this speciation event to come about. So that's one of the early examples of evolution via natural selection, and this is probably the experiment that kind of brought evolution into the mainstream. And lastly, I just want to have a brief discussion of artificial selection. We'll talk more about this a little bit later on as time goes on in, I think, Unit 3. We've been talking about natural selection, which is something that's the result of mostly artificial, natural environmental changes over time. Like all these examples we've been talking about here, these are all examples of evolution via natural selection. But artificial selection is something entirely different. This is something where people intentionally take living things from nature and artificially breed them through the generations to get some kind of desired product or some kind of desired morphology. A good example of this is dogs. All dogs, as we discussed, are the same species, right? For the purposes of the biological species concept. And yet we have all these different dog breeds that are the result of artificial selection where people, some people specifically bred dogs to be good hunting dogs. Some people specifically bred dogs to be, to have fluffy hair or to fit in a purse or, whatever the case may be. They're all the same species and yet they've been artificially selected for where people using our wits have intentionally bred things in very specific controlled ways. That is not evolution. Another example of this is our food, our industrial food system. A lot of the foods that we eat on a day-to-day basis are not the foods that exist in nature. They are traits that people have taken from nature and bred over the course of many generations to get traits that are advantageous. So apples, for example, are not really a natural thing. So-called natural apples don't really exist. A lot of the fruits that we eat are the product of, there's one specific fruit that someone noticed X number of years ago that is, obviously a bigger fruit is better than a smaller fruit. And so people take those bigger fruit and they breed that fruit through multiple generations and they get something that is really usable. Another example is look at cauliflower, broccoli, cabbage, kale, kohlrabi. All of those are basically the same plant that comes from the same wild mustard, but they all look so different, right? Well, all of that is the result of natural selection. They're just different cultivars that people have bred along specific lines for specific reasons. Another example is corn. A lot of the corn, the corn that we eat today, these big yellowish husks, it's a grass, but it is very much the result of natural selection. If you go back to like the native triticum grass of the native wild relative of corn, it looked something more like this. But someone came along X numbers of years ago and saw something like this. Oh, this has bigger fruit that are more nutritious for me. I'm going to take that and grow it in my garden, and I'm going to crossbreed it with other individuals that are like that. And I'm going to do that again and again and again and again and again, artificially, until ultimately you end up with something like this that is, is different from this in terms of its physiology, but this process of artificial selecting is not evolution. It's not happening naturally. So anyway, that concludes the material that I want to cover for the purposes of Unit 1. We're going to have our study session a little bit later today, or excuse me, on Wednesday, the 16th, to go over everything we've talked about from the first lecture all the way till today. So please join in on Zoom. I'm going to go ahead and hop on Zoom here real quick, or not Zoom, hop on Chrome. So just as a reminder, this Zoom link that I'm on for all the lecture recordings, as well as for the study sessions, it's right here. So if ever you need to meet with me or for coming on to lecture or for study sessions, it's this link right here underneath the lecture tab. So this is the exact same Zoom link that if you click on this link and bring up Zoom, this is the Zoom link that you can use to get to the study session the day after tomorrow. And then just another thing to point out, the Urban Ecology Lab is now live. I gave it 2 weeks for you to do it. So you have 2 whole weeks to do this. Here is the instruction document. It seems to me to be pretty straightforward. So give this a read. It's loading still, but give this a read. It's got a little bit of introductory material right there. Basically, what I've asked you to do is collect data on your own waste production in terms of non-recyclable trash versus recyclable trash. Weigh that out, whether it be just for yourself or for your entire household over the course of 3 days. Here it is. Weigh that out over the course of 3 days and get some data and write up your data in your biology lab notebook. Make a title, have an abstract section, which is kind of a summary paragraph at the end, a little bit of introduction, describe what you did, describe what you found, including a figure that can follow the format of something like this, and then a discussion. You know, I gave you some suggested lengths because I know people like to have how long does this need to be. It seems to me to be pretty straightforward, but please let me know if you need more pointers on how to do this. This is basically your own standalone experiment. And so you have 2 weeks to do this. This will be due again on September 28th, which is 2 weeks from today. So you do not have a lab that's due next week. And also, going back to the homepage here, there is a study guide that's now live as well, which you can go to. And it's very brief. It basically just lays out some of the terms, the key terms we've talked about that throughout this whole unit. And I also gave you some tips for studying here. So please email me if you have any questions. Other than that, I will be hanging out on Zoom at 8:30 p.m. this Wednesday. Please come in. As I've said, I've had review sessions be non-existent. No one seems to have questions. I've also had review sessions that last for 3 hours. So it just depends on the questions you ask. That's also, I don't write the exam until after the review session. So, you know, the level of input you provide me can be really helpful. You know, I haven't written the exam yet. So you tell me what you want the exam to be on. Bring those types of questions. You know, you can manipulate me a little bit if you want, but you have to participate. Come into that Zoom session and ask any questions. And with that, the exam is going to be a week from today on Monday between 5:30 and 8:30 p.m. So with that said, let me know if you have any questions and hope everyone is doing well. All right, bye-bye.